Gaura Devi was a little girl. She was only 8 years old, and she lived in northern India, near the Himalayan mountains. And in her village, near the mountains, she could see the beautiful snow-capped mountains. Early in the morning, the sun would come up and the snow would sparkle like diamonds. She lived in such a beautiful place. What a fortunate little girl. And as little girls do, she had some chores to do. Her job, early in the morning, when she first woke up, was to take the goats to pasture. And then when she came home with the goats, she'd eat her breakfast, and then she had to go with her aunt into the forest where they would collect herbs and plants because her aunt was the healer of their village. Well, she and her aunt would come home and they would have lunch, and later in the afternoon, she would go with her mother back to the forest to collect firewood. Gaura Devi was only 8 years old, and all this walking on her little legs was starting to tire her. One day she said to her mother, "You know, wouldn't it be easier if we just cut down some trees and drag them to the village, and then we wouldn't have to walk 3 times a day to go get firewood?" Well, Gaura Devi's mother looked at her very seriously, kind of like your mother would if you said, "Why can't we go to Disneyland?" Well, Gaura Devi's mother said, "Gaura, we cannot cut down the trees. We must never cut the trees. The trees are our brothers and our sisters. They provide homes for the animals. They provide shade for the plants that you and your aunt gather to keep us all healthy. But most importantly, Gaura Devi, those trees have roots that reach down deep into the earth and hold on to the dirt. And those roots hold the water, because without those trees, when the spring rains come, our village would just wash right down the mountainside." Well, Gaura Devi was a little girl. She didn't understand everything that her mother was telling her. But she really liked that idea that the trees were her brothers and her sisters, kind, generous, older brothers and sisters who didn't tease her like her brother did, or take her things like her little sister did. Well, one day when Gaura Devi went to the forest, was coming home from the field with her goats, she walked by the forest. And she heard a rumbling behind her, and she looked down the road and could see this long line of trucks driving up the road. It was rare that any cars or trucks ever came to her village. And she stopped to watch as this long line of trucks came, and they parked right next to the forest. Well, this was very interesting. And the men climbed out of the cabs, and they went to the back of their trucks, and they pulled out chainsaws and axes and lengths of rope. And they put gasoline into the chainsaws, and they started them up, and that sharp sound, it cut into that quiet air, and the birds flew off. And Gaura Devi, who was not shy, went up to one of the men and said, "What are you doing here?" And the man looked down at the little girl and said, "We're here to cut down the trees." "No, no," said Gaura Devi, "you mustn't cut the trees. They are our brothers and our sisters." And the man looked like he had expected to hear something like this, but not from someone quite so young. And he mumbled something about just doing his job and "run along, little girl." And she watched for a little while. And she backed away. And then she turned around and started walking, and soon she was running as fast as her skinny little legs would take her, right back to the village. In the middle of their village was a big bell, a gong, and she picked up the mallet that was almost as big as she was, and she banged that gong, bong, bong. And soon the women and the children came running. The men were off working. And they said, "What's wrong? What's happened? Has someone been hurt? Who died?" And Gaura Devi, who was still shaken from her run, and her arms were still shaking from banging that gong with that big mallet, could only point down the road and say, "The trees, the trees." And the women knew what was happening. They ran down toward the forest, their saris flapping behind them in the breeze, the colors shining and shimmering in the sunlight, the grandmothers with the babies bouncing on their backs. They ran as fast as they could right down to the forest, where the men were starting to cut down the trees. When the men saw the women, they stopped what they were doing, and they turned off their chainsaws. And they looked at the women and the children. The women and the children looked at the men. No one knew what to do, but Gaura Devi looked at those chainsaws, and she looked at her brother and her sister, and she thought about those saws cutting through their bodies. And she knew what she had to do. She put her arms around a tree, and her little sister went to the other side of the tree and put her arms around the tree, and their fingers touched as the two sisters held that tree in their warm embrace. And then Gaura Devi's mother put her arms around a tree, and her brother did, and soon all of the women and children were hugging the trees. The men couldn't cut the trees, and so they put those chainsaws back in their trucks, and they coiled up the lengths of rope, and they put their axes back in the trucks, and they climbed into the cabs, and they drove back down the mountain. The women and children stayed there with the trees until they could no longer hear the diesel engines. And then, laughing and cheering, they danced back to the village. And when the men came home that night, they held a big feast to celebrate their peaceful victory. That was in March of 1974. And today we call that the Chipko movement, which means to hug, tree huggers in Hindi. And that movement spread all throughout India, and it has spread all around the world. And it all started with the brave act of one little girl who hugged the trees. Gaura Devi and the tree huggers.
Oh, very nice.
Thank you.